Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Supply Chain Now Radio. We're broadcasting live today from the supply chain capital of the East Coast, Atlanta, Georgia. Today's episode is sponsored by APICS Southeast District. My name is Scott Luton. I serve as your host for today's session. I also serve on the APICS Southeast District staff. So what is APICS, you ask? Well, we'll provide background on that in just a moment. Our session today will focus on successfully applying project management in supply chain to help digest the rapidly increasing rate of change. Today we'll be featuring Mr. Daniel Stanton, author of the new book, Supply Chain Management for Dummies, and president and co-founder of SecureMarking. More about Daniel in just a moment. But as always, we're glad to have you with us here today. So let's tackle our ground rules. So all of our attendees will be on mute as we're looking to optimize the audio experience. With that said, now let's make it as interactive as possible. So please do submit your questions via the chat toolbar. We'll gather those and answer as many as we have time for at the conclusion of today's webinar. Finally, a PDF of today's presentation and the recording will be sent out in the next few days to each of our registrants. As I mentioned, today's webinar is brought to you by APICS Southeast District, a team of volunteers that support about 30 APICS chapters throughout the southeastern United States. For those of you new to APICS, we are the premier industry association dedicated to end-to-end supply chain management. Our organization offers membership and professional development, a wide range of education opportunities, industry-leading research and publications, and widely recognized professional certifications. More than anything else, though, APICS is about people. Our organization has over 45,000 members in over 100 countries. APICS has 195 North American chapters that serve a wide variety of key geographic markets, including our newest chapter in the dynamic logistics market of Savannah, Georgia. You may recognize our leading certifications, such as our CPIM, our CSCP, and our CLTD. If you want more information on how we can serve you or your organization, please feel free to reach out to those of us that serve on the APICS Southeast District. We're happy to help, and you can also find out more information on our organization at apics.org. All right, so let's share a little more information about our speaker today. You're in for a treat. Daniel Stanton is author of the new Amazon bestseller, Supply Chain Management for Dummies, and our running joke is that book was written for me, Daniel. He's also president and co-founder of SecureMarking, a US-based provider of high-tech supply chain security solutions. Having collaborated with Daniel for several years, I can vouch for his true passion for supply chain and project management. Beyond his new book, which is a #1 new release on Amazon, Daniel's courses on LinkedIn Learning have been viewed over 350,000 times. His articles and blogs have been published in a variety of magazines and trade journals, including APICS Magazine and Supply Chain Management Review. Academically, Daniel earned a Master's of Engineering degree in Logistics from MIT. He is a doctoral researcher at Cranfield University and holds several industry certifications, including his Six Sigma Black Belt, his PMP, also stands for Project Management Professional, CSCP, which stands for Certified Supply Chain Professional, and his SC Pro. Daniel's company, SecureMarking, leverages nanotechnology, IoT, and blockchains to address the urgent challenge of supply chain security. With all that said, I know that you'll enjoy learning from Daniel just as I have. So with no further ado, here's Mr. Daniel Stanton.
Scott, thank you so much for that, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and support the district and meet with your audience this afternoon. I really love what you've been doing with the Supply Chain Now program, and I'm just honored and delighted to be a part of it. So, Scott, when you and I were talking recently, we got to talking about the direct project leadership approach, which is a system that I use for leading supply chain projects, and it was the subject of an article that we published in APICS Magazine this summer, and thought it'd be worthwhile to do a deeper dive and talk through the direct method and how it applies to leading supply chain projects with your audience. So a lot of this material, like I say, you know, we talked about it in the APICS Magazine article, but here we'll give kind of a high level talk and maybe put a little bit of color around some of those ideas. So why do we need another project leadership model, right? Because the Project Management Institute has their own model for managing projects, embodied in they call it the project management body of knowledge. We have similar stuff in the supply chain side. APICS folks in particular spend a lot of time looking at the SCORE model. But the challenge that I've found working in supply chains is when you look at what causes projects to fail, when things go south, when things go wrong, what actually are the causes of those problems? And how does that tie back into the way that we approach project management? So the Project Management Institute actually studies this, and every year they go out and they do a survey of folks that are involved in projects and say, hey, for the ones that didn't work, why? What went wrong? So here are the statistics from what they call the pulse of the profession from this year, from 2017. And 41% of the projects that didn't work out, that were deemed failures, there was, the issue was at least in part a change in the organization's priorities. And then, the other ones that you see high on the list are inaccurate requirements gathering, changes in the project objectives, inadequate vision or goals for the project. And as you go down that list, if you think in terms of the difference between management and leadership, it becomes pretty clear that the problems aren't necessarily management problems. They really have a lot more to do with leadership. So I would argue that part of the problem is we're focused on the wrong issues, and that causes projects to fail. So why does that matter? Well, first and foremost, in the world of supply chain management, we're always looking for improvement. We're always transforming, adopting new technologies and new processes. And the way that we make changes in a company is through projects. Projects, the leaders of those projects are really responsible for making and keeping promises to the business, right? They're saying, here's what we're going to get done. Here are the resources that we need to do it. And if you give us those resources, we will deliver a certain result. And the truth is, the big gap, the true cause of most failures in projects is actually ties back to leadership. So how do you lead a project? And how is that different from managing? So, managing is really about taking the resources that you have and optimizing the performance. Whereas leadership really goes back to identifying what are the changes we need to make? What resources do we need to have in order to do that successfully? What sort of a team? What sort of money? What is the vision that we need to be working towards, and what resources do we need to get there? So I make the argument, and I use the analogy that it's a lot like being a movie director, right? So if you are the leader of a supply chain project, you don't have to be the expert in every aspect of that transformation. In the same way that a movie director doesn't need to be a great actor, doesn't need to know how to do pyrotechnics, doesn't need to know anything about catering. But the director's role is to understand what needs to happen, what it needs to look like, and then bring in the right people to do those activities, those functions, and then coordinate it to make sure that it happens in the right sequence and at the right time. So the leader doesn't have to be the expert in any one of the functional disciplines, but the leader does need to understand the language well enough, the jargon, so that they really get the challenges that their teams are facing and can help to identify conflicts, identify gaps, and help to resolve them. I think many of us may have been in the position that we were working on a project and we recognized a challenge that was a technical sort of a challenge. And when we took it to the leader of the project, we weren't able to get the support or get the understanding of what the problem was and why it was so important and needed to be resolved, simply because the leader didn't understand the technical elements well enough for us to be able to communicate it. So, given that, with using this movie director metaphor, a project leader actually has 6 fundamental responsibilities. The first of those responsibilities is to define the objective. The project leader needs to make sure that everybody on the team clearly understands the opportunity that the project is intended to capture or the challenge that they're trying to overcome. Right? And so this is, being able to explain it in language that everybody understands, which, in a global supply chain could literally be different languages, or in cross-functional supply chains, it could be in either in the technical jargon that's appropriate to each of the functions, or in language that's free of that technical jargon so that everybody can understand it. And part of communicating the opportunity or the challenge is expressing it in terms of the value that it provides to the business. Is this project important because it's going to help us increase our service levels? Is this project important because it's going to help us grow our market share? Is this project important because it's going to allow us to be successful in an omni-channel environment where we wouldn't otherwise be able to do that? So explaining the opportunity and challenge in terms of value to the business is an important part of what the leader needs to do and what the leader needs to make sure is being done. Another part of defining the objective is being clear about what's in scope and what's out of scope for the project. I think most folks at this point are familiar with the term scope creep, where you start working on a project and pretty soon new requirements, new criteria start getting added without making modifications to the budget, without providing additional resources, without changing the timeline. And scope creep is very often the cause of failure in projects. So one way to inoculate your project from scope creep is to clearly define what's in scope and what's out of scope. Now that said, there are times that the scope needs to change. And so part of what the leader should do is make sure that there's a process in place for reviewing proposed changes to the scope and approving them if they're appropriate, but approving them with an understanding of the impacts that it will have on budget and timeline in order for that to be successful. Really, the projects that I've seen work the best and the leaders that I've seen be the most effective are the ones that capture all of this information in a formal project charter. Project charter doesn't need to be fancy, frankly, and the best ones that I've seen aren't that complicated. They're 1 or 2 page memos that you can pick up and read and very quickly understand why is the project important, how would you measure success, what's in scope, what's out of scope, what resources are you intending to dedicate to the project. I'll go a step further and say it really is a good idea to sit down and have the project leader sign the charter, right? Because with the act of putting your signature on a piece of paper somehow forces a much higher level of attention and sense of accountability for what we just said is a promise that you're making to the business. So, first responsibility of a project leader is defining the objective. The second responsibility of the project leader is to make sure that you're investigating your options. There's a story or a concept that's illustrated by a story called the Abilene complex, where groups of people make a choice to do something not because it's the right thing to do, but simply because people aren't comfortable disagreeing in the group. So, we talk about this as being, the challenge of managing agreement, right? What do you do if somebody puts forth a proposal for a project and the other people in the room don't know enough to challenge it and say, I'm not sure that that's really a good idea, or because of power dynamics in an organization, people don't want to challenge the leader. And all of these are different ways that can lead to the Abilene complex, where people do agree to do something, but then once you actually start working on the project and get a little ways down the road, they turn to each other and say, why are we doing this? This isn't a good idea, right? And the problem fundamentally comes back to thinking through what your options are, right? Investigating the different paths that you could take to achieve that objective or opportunity that you've defined. A couple of tools that are actually come out of the Lean and Six Sigma toolbox that can be really useful for this responsibility of investigating the options. One is brainstorming, where you get people together and you just start pulling ideas out of them. And now that you've identified the problem, let's think about different ways that we could solve that. Let's get as creative as we can. There are no bad ideas. You can't challenge an idea. You can't change an idea. You just keep adding new and more ideas into the mix so that you really can start triggering people's creativity and getting a broad look at the different ways that you could achieve an objective. Of course, the challenge with brainstorming is you come up with a lot of ideas through that process that are redundant and a lot of ideas that just really aren't that practical. And so it's also helpful to take the output of that brainstorming exercise and then use an affinity diagramming exercise where you start taking the ideas and grouping them together. The ones that are similar from the brainstorming become themes through affinity diagramming. And as you get these themes shaping up as your different options, then you can start to make some intelligent decisions about how each one of those different directions compares to the other in terms of how effectively they align with the goals of your project, and how much they would cost, how long it would take to do them. One of the challenges that teams often run into when investigating their options is analysis paralysis, right? Where you keep needing more information, wanting more information. There's still a level of uncertainty. And the truth is, we live in a world where you're never going to have perfect information. Part of what we need to do as business people, part of what we need to do when we manage supply chains is be comfortable taking risks. But the question is, at what point do you move from just wild risk taking and gambling to, on the other extreme, being slow to make a decision and really not willing to take the risks that you need to for the business to be successful. So, I mean, that's a balance that we all work through. The best answer that I've ever heard for that came from former Secretary of State Colin Powell, who talked about using the 70% rule. And when he described this, what he said is, when I'm looking at making a decision, if I don't feel at least 70% confident, then I probably don't have enough information, and I need to send folks back to answer some more questions. If I have more than 70% of a level of confidence, I'm probably being too hesitant, and I need to move more quickly and be more confident making decisions. So second step here for leading supply chain projects is investigating the options, and some tools here that you can use to do that, and some things to watch out for in the process. The third responsibility for a project leader is resolving to a course of action. And really, this is a fancy way of saying distill it down into a plan, right? So you've looked at your options, you've got an understanding of what the trade-offs for each one are. Now you need to pick one and commit to doing that. One of the great tools for resolving to a course of action is the RACI matrix. Again, a common tool in the Lean Six Sigma toolbox, where you identify the different activities or functions, and then you look at the people on the team and you decide who's responsible for contributing to each of those activities. Who is the one and only one person that's accountable for each of those activities, and for each one, who needs to be consulted and who needs to be informed. I find that doing the RACI matrix early on, before building a project plan, can really help get a team aligned on roles and responsibilities, and that puts us in a better position to go to that next step of building the project plan. Now, one of the things I'll say about project planning, I always get scared when I walk into a meeting and I see a PowerPoint presentation with a Gantt chart that's been created in either Excel or especially in PowerPoint, because all that is a pretty picture. But if the Gantt chart is just drawn using graphic software, it doesn't really have any meaning. For me, the value of project management software isn't that it gives you pretty pictures. The value of that software is that it simulates the performance of a project. What project management software actually does is it looks at all the activities that you say you need to do, and which ones can run in parallel, which ones need to run sequentially, and it simulates how that project will play out in terms of time and cost based on your assumptions and your predictions that you're feeding into the model. One of the things so that's really critical, running that simulation before you start committing resources and doing the work on a project, so that you've got an accurate estimate of how it's actually going to work. But it becomes even more important once you start executing the project, because by having that project simulation already programmed, then as you get new information and are able to update, you're essentially able to continue running new simulations about how you expect the project to turn out. And you just absolutely get none of that value if you settle for creating a pretty picture, like I say, in PowerPoint or in Excel. One other tool that I really think project leaders need to be looking for and expecting from their teams as a part of resolving to a course of action is a risk register. And with a risk register, the idea is you go out and you say, okay, based on our plan, based on what we're expecting to happen, what are the things that could go wrong? Where are the places that we have uncertainty, where we have risks? And for each of those, how would it affect us? So one of the things that to help prioritize with a risk register is you can go through all of those risks that you identify and try to gauge how likely it is that they'll materialize, what the probability is, and then how severe the impact of each of those risks would be if it materialized. Then you can take that probability, multiply it by the impact, you get a new number called the risk index, and you can rank order your risks based on that risk index, right? And so that becomes a really handy tool for figuring out what are the things that you really need to be paying attention to and likely mitigating before you commit to a plan and before you start executing with it. And in particular, how are you going to respond to each of those risks that you've identified. And the response could be that we're just going to accept that risk. We're willing to live with that. The response could be we want to transfer that risk to somebody else. Maybe you can buy an insurance policy or write a contract that makes it somebody else's problem. It could be that the risk is so severe that you say we need to avoid that. We have to do something different so that this is not a risk because we can't accept it. Or the fourth option is you can choose to do something. You can mitigate the risk. And mitigation really is just about reducing the probability, the likelihood that the risk will occur, or reducing the impact. So making it so that if the risk did occur, it wouldn't have as severe of an impact on your supply chain. So that's the third responsibility of a project leader, is resolving to a course of action. The fourth one is making sure that the team executes the plan. Obviously, one of the responsibilities of a project leader is to track the progress towards the goals. So in order to do that, you need to have metrics. You need to define what success looks like. You need to define what progress looks like. What are the criteria? What are the metrics that you can use to get the best picture of what's really happening, and where issues may be emerging that need executive attention. There's nothing worse than leading a project or being involved in a project and thinking that things are on track, only to be surprised because something wasn't getting done and you didn't know about it, right? And so that's the point of tracking progress and having metrics, is to tell whether things are going according to plan, and if not, do you need to do something different or do you need to change the plan? I find that really the best way to exercise this leadership responsibility of executing the plan is by having a project scorecard. And really, scorecards work best when they are done on a rhythm, when they're done routinely. So, for example, it's very common for the projects that I lead that I'll look to do a weekly scorecard update. So, once a week, we've got key activities, key metrics that folks need to report their progress on. That all gets consolidated into a single executive scorecard. Everybody knows when it needs to be done, so there's never a surprise. And one of the things that it lets us do, of course, it lets us track our progress as we're going, talk honestly and transparently about where we're ahead, where we're behind, where we're on track. But those scorecards also become a really useful tool after the fact for doing lessons learned, and for figuring out what happened, why it happened, and how we can build on that learning to become better at leading and managing projects in the future. The third point about executing the plan is this concept of the triple constraints. So with any project, you've got three constraints that you've got to manage to: the scope, what you're going to get done; the schedule, the amount of time that it's going to take you to do it; and the budget, how much money you're going to spend. So the scope, the schedule, and the budget, those are the triple constraints. And what's really interesting about it is how interdependent they are. So we talked earlier about scope creep and scope change. Very common that you get into a project and somebody says, listen, we said we were going to do this, but now we realize we can't do that unless we add on, this additional bit of work. The answer has to be okay. I mean, if that is a requirement in order for this project to move forward, then let's review that. But the thing to look for is not just what additional work needs to be done, but how that affects the other constraints of time and schedule. Very, very rarely are you able to add scope to a project without either increasing the time or increasing the cost, or both. The flip side of that is, there are times that you'll be working on a project and somebody will come back and say, listen, we're not meeting our numbers for the quarter. We need to find a way to identify savings, and where can we shave money off of this project? Well, you can work the problem in reverse and say, what can we take out of scope? What work that we had committed to can we now take off of the plate? Because very likely that's what's going to allow us to reduce our costs and accelerate the project. So understanding the relationship between those triple constraints of scope, schedule, and budget becomes a really important tool for leaders to use as the plan is being executed. So executing the plan is the fourth responsibility of a project leader. The fifth responsibility for the project leader is changing over to the new system. It's amazing. It just almost every supply chain project that you look at, the change, the go live, is a project in itself. There's all the work that's required to get ready for it. For example, if you're starting up a new distribution center, right? You've got to procure the land, you've got to install the communication stuff, you've got to put up the racks, you've got to hire and train your workforce. There's all of this stuff that needs to be planned for and done. And then you've got your go live, which, in the course of a very short period of time, you go from a facility that was pre-opening to a facility that's operational. And there's a whole lot of stuff that needs to get done. That changeover really ends up being a project in itself. And the best project leaders that I've worked with understand that and make sure that there's a plan to handle that changeover. There are different strategies for doing that changeover. If you're going from one IT system to another, you can actually have a hard cutover where you shut one system down and turn the other system on. Sometimes that really is the best way to do it, the only way to do it. Of course, that has some risk with it and can be complicated. Another approach that you'll see very often is to do a soft launch, right? So to take the new system, whatever that is, that could be a computer system, it could be a facility, and to start using it slowly, not advertise it, let the supply chain continue operating the way that it had been, just gradually start introducing this new capability in parallel to the old stuff. And then at some point, decommission the old one. So that soft launch can sometimes be a little bit easier transition startup than doing a hard cutover. One of the things that I've really seen be an important part of making any change to a supply chain is doing user acceptance testing. And I'll go back to the example of doing, for example, a distribution center startup, where you'll have a functional team that's in charge of preparing the physical facility, and then you'll have another team that's responsible for doing the slotting in the racks, and you'll have another team that's in charge of getting the warehouse management system up and running. And there's a really good chance that every one of those teams is doing testing along the way to make sure that their part of the project is working. They've got some process for doing sign-offs, check-offs before they approve stuff and make it ready. But supply chains are complex systems. And it's amazing how often the IT folks can think that their part is working right, and the slotting folks can think that their part is working right, but somehow the end-to-end process has a gap or a breakdown. And so one of the things that's really important in planning for this changeover is to do that end-to-end testing of your process across the functions. And that's really what user acceptance testing is all about. So, what you do with user acceptance testing is create some scenarios, right? What are some of the processes that we need to be able to execute, and walk through them step by step in your whole system to make sure that everything works, and do that in advance of the go live, right? Don't wait for your startup day. Don't wait for your launch day to be testing those end-to-end processes for the first time. You know, the last point in changing over to the new system is doing contingency planning. So it's new by definition. That's what projects are about. It's a unique one-time activity. Nobody's ever done exactly this before. What if something doesn't go right? What if the warehouse management system isn't able to process orders on the go live day the way that you expected it to? What if the communications don't work, or your team isn't able to operate at the speed that you need them to? A really important part of making that changeover, and a part of the leader's responsibility, is to make sure that people are thinking through those risks and preparing contingencies for them, right? If that happens, what will we do? Can we stop the go live and continue going with the old system while we fix the problem? Or are we just going to shut down the business until we get it fixed? All right, so changing over to the new system, that's the 5th responsibility for a project leader. And the 6th and final responsibility for the project leader is transitioning the people. So the important point here, you know, people very often use the terms change and transition interchangeably. There's this fellow by the name of William Bridges, though, who makes the argument that those are two very different things. And what Bridges says is that a change is something that occurs in our physical environment. It's something that happens around us. Essentially, it's something that happens to us. A transition is how we as people respond to that change. So a change is a physical thing. A transition is an emotional one. And you know, it's funny because, you know, we see this all the time in supply chain. You know, I think most folks agree supply chains are made up of people, processes, and technologies. We tend to be pretty good at planning for changes in processes, right? It's what we do with Six Sigma. It's what we do with Lean. We tend to be pretty good at planning changes in technologies, right? And we spend a lot of time doing ERP implementations and warehouse management system changes. But we don't very often talk about the transitions that our people need to make. So, you know, what Bridges says is, you know, that the emotional piece, the transition, involves three steps. And the first is the ending. Whatever it was you were doing before stops, and people need to adapt to that. And we go through endings all the time in our lives with, you know, when we leave a job, when we lose a family member or a friend. It's a change, but then the emotional response is accepting that the old way has ended. Once you accept that ending, emotionally we go into this period that Bridges calls the neutral zone. And it's a time when people frankly kind of don't know what to do. You know, you're uncomfortable, you're nervous, you're looking for answers, maybe a bit distrustful. But eventually, as people become more accustomed to the change, to whatever's happened around them, they transition from that neutral zone into a new beginning, into an emotional state where they've accepted the new version of reality, and are ready to move on and be a part of it. Understanding that really is a leadership responsibility, right? Whether you're changing a distribution system, changing an information system, you need to think through the fact that people are doing their job one way today, and they may have been doing it that way for a long time. And there actually is going to be some emotional impact on them of taking that away and making them do it a new way. And this model from Bridges of looking at the ending, the neutral zone, and the new beginning is a good way to think about how to approach that. Another really useful tool for thinking about this transition comes from Janine Lamar. And she thinks about it in terms of the people and the roles that they play in driving a change. So she sees the change sponsors as the people that have the vision and the authority to make it happen. She sees change agents as people that are able to exercise influence and encourage other people to move forward and accept the change. And then the change targets are the people who are going to be impacted by the change. And so Lamarche has a really useful model then to think about who are the people that are going to be impacted by the change, who can we have as agents to help them through that transition, what sort of sponsorship do the change agents need so that they can be successful. The last point on transitioning the people is that we have short attention spans, we have short memories. It's part of the human experience. And so the project leader needs to make sure that we're over communicating. Be clear about the message and repeat it again and repeat it again, so that there is no question and so that we're helping people confidently move through this transition from the ending to the neutral zone to the new beginning. So that's the direct project leadership framework. You know, the 6 responsibilities of the project leader are to define the objective, investigate the options, resolve to a course of action, execute the plan, change over to the new system, and transition the people. One of the things that becomes really useful about this is if you're working on a project today and you're finding that the project is struggling, you can go through these 6 responsibilities and very likely identify where you have gaps and what you need to do to close them. And I'm confident if you do this, that you will quickly identify ways to make your projects much more successful, and in turn to make you more successful as a leader. All of that brings me back to a quote that I love from Admiral Hopper. You manage things, you lead people. And that's really where we started this whole discussion, right? Is rather than blaming project management for failures, let's look at it through a lens of project leadership and decide what we can do to help people be more successful by being better leaders. So that's the talk about the direct framework, and I'll be glad to take questions in just a moment. I do want to put in a quick plug for a wonderful organization, and an organization that I think the whole supply chain and logistics community should be aware of, and that's the American Logistics Aid Network. You know, this has been a pretty tough year for hurricanes, and today, you know, we're seeing an outbreak of wildfires out in California. When these things happen, when we face disasters, the supply chain community plays an enormous role in helping people and getting things back to normal. The American Logistics Aid Network is a nonprofit that exists to bring our community together so that we can help others in times of need. So an easy way, if you want to help, if you want to get involved, go to allanaid.org. You can see on the website ways to get engaged. They have a tool where you can donate time, resources, capacity. You can see what they have needs for today. And of course, like all nonprofits, they're always grateful for financial support from individuals and organizations. So with that, Scott, I'd like to say thank you, and I'll turn it back over to you, and maybe we can take a few questions.
Definitely. Daniel, great stuff. So before you and I got on today, I chaired our Apix Atlanta Executive Advisory Board, and we had about 15, 20 executives, supply chain executives, and we near the end of that meeting, we polled some of the things that are keeping them up at night. And contingency planning was a big one. That was a big common theme. And so as you walk through this direct framework, I saw a lot of helpful information, tools, and approaches that can help companies be prepared for when wildfires threaten, or when hurricanes threaten, or other natural disasters. So really, I thought great information sharing with our audience today. So thanks for that, Daniel. We've got 4 questions teed up already from our audience. And again, to our audience, we're going to take the next 10 minutes or so and pose some questions to Daniel. So feel free to submit your questions via the chat toolbar. Okay, our first question, Daniel, comes from Lamar. And Lamar asks, who is the project leader and who should be using the direct approach?
Well, Lamar, I got to say, that is a great question. So thank you for that. The truth is, I like to think of lots of people on the project being leaders, right? Because leader is more a state of mind than a role. But very specifically, where I see the direct model being most important is what I'll say the project sponsor. So whoever is ultimately accountable for the success of the project. So that is likely a functional owner of some sort, but it's somebody that has the authority to make decisions, to dedicate resources to getting something done, and is then making a promise to the business that, this is what we need to do, here's why we need to do it, here are the resources that I need to accomplish it, and if you give that to me, then I will make sure that my team delivers those results. So, in many cases that's a project sponsor. In many cases, it could be, in the supply chain world, more than one person. I've certainly worked on projects where there were, multiple vice presidents or even leaders of multiple organizations that had shared accountability for the success of a project, working with customers, working with suppliers. And in that case, I would argue that all of them are leaders, and the direct approach and the direct tools are equally valid and valuable for all of them.
Excellent. Great question, Lamar. Appreciate your perspective there, Daniel. Next question comes from Gloria. And Gloria kind of piggybacks on that first question, but she asked, what kinds of projects does this direct approach work for?
Gloria, again, a great question, right? And this is the thing that's so challenging, but for me, so interesting and exciting about working in the supply chain is, we are, faced with projects from everything from inventory optimization to new software system selection and implementation, to facility startups, to supplier onboarding and customer onboarding. Any time that you're making a change in the supply chain, it's a project. And again, like I was saying a moment ago, I think this direct approach really works for any kind of supply chain project, because the key is to make sure that there's somebody in that director role, aligning the resources that you have with the goals of the organization, not getting too far down in the weeds, but staying close enough to make sure that the team is doing what they're supposed to do, that what they're doing is the right thing, and that they're bringing all of the stakeholders along for the journey. So, good question. Thank you, Gloria.
Great question, Gloria. Next question comes from Elina, Daniel. And Elina says, first off, thank you, Daniel, for a great presentation. What has your experience been with RACI and assigning roles during IT/tech projects, knowing there's a shift to a more flexible/agile project management style?
It's a great question, Elina, and I think it has a lot to do with the culture of the organization and the perspectives of the team. I'm doing a lot of work these days in the startup world with angel investors and venture capital folks. And those people put an awful lot of emphasis on clear accountability. They want to know who is the one person that is accountable for each activity, which is really exactly what the RACI matrix is designed to do. I will say my own experience, putting together RACI matrices and specifically with IT groups, I've run into this a lot of times where you've got an activity and 2 or 3 people in the room say, well, I'm accountable for that. No, I'm accountable for that. Well, just make us all accountable. And first of all, I'll say that, from my perspective, really, if everybody's accountable, then nobody's accountable. It really is much more effective, much more powerful if you can identify one person as the accountable owner for a task and then identify the others as responsible, meaning they have to do work. They have to contribute in order for that task to be successful. But still pointing back to the one owner. There have been times when you get to a task that people say, there's absolutely no way that you can have that task and not have 2 or 3 or more people all accountable. And what I generally try to do in that situation is figure out how we can divide that task into multiple tasks and have only one person accountable for each of those new tasks that we've created. But the RACI matrix isn't the right tool and isn't the right fix for every situation. But truthfully, I think, having that accountability, having one person to go to, if nothing else, to ask for updates and to expect them to be able to give an answer really becomes important for a project leader. And I think the RACI matrix is a useful tool to articulate that and get it done. Good question, Elina. Thank you.
Yeah, great question, Elina. And Daniel, I'm going to ask a follow-up on your last point there, as it relates to a project leader getting out and getting things done. You mentioned communication and over-communication earlier. A great friend and network colleague of mine has a saying where he says, open door policies are for weenies. Get out of your chair and lead. Can you share your perspective on that as it relates to project management? You just kind of painted that picture where you're in a project meeting and fingers are pointing. I thought this, that, and the other. Talk about how important it is to get out and proactively see where the gaps are and see what's not being communicated and uncover problems. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Well, no, absolutely, Scott. I think anybody that's been doing this for any length of time has seen that. And getting out, seeing what's really happening, management by walking around, I think are really key. I would tie it back into the execution and the scorecards. You should be getting an update every week on what's happening, and you should be able to walk around and make sure that what you're seeing with your eyes matches what you're seeing on the scorecard. Because it isn't just about painting pretty pictures and having nice reports. It's really about, are we getting where we need to be with the project? One example that it brings to mind, I was managing a startup of a facility a few years ago, and one of the activities on the project plan was putting together the standard work and posting it at each of the workstations in the facility. And that activity had been checked off as being completed, and so it looked like we were doing fine on our project plan. And I had the opportunity to then go up, take a tour of the facility, walk around, and just by chance went over and grabbed the standard work at one of the work centers and started flipping through it. And it was obvious that it was wrong. It was incomplete. It was kind of a standard template that was really a placeholder as opposed to the standard work. You're never going to catch that if you're sitting in your office just looking at the scorecards. So it goes back to this idea of making and keeping promises, and maybe the phrase "trust but verify," right?
That's
So.
right. Trust in God, all others bring data, I think is the famous quote. uh, thanks for sharing your perspective there. Last question today comes from David. And David says, "Hi, Daniel. Thanks for the knowledge and experience sharing. So question, could you elaborate on the difference between the roles of a project leader and a project manager?"
Yep. Great question, David. And that's, kind of we talked about a little bit at the very beginning. The easiest way for me to do that, and frankly, this is a pretty good exercise to do yourself, and often with teams to say, what are the characteristics that you associate with a leader, and what are the characteristics that you associate with a manager, right? And so management is about um, tracking status and making directing the resources that are there, and reporting on how things are progressing. Whereas leadership, when people talk about that word, it's more about inspiring people, helping people, figuring out where we need to go, setting direction, creating that vision. And so whereas manager is really a job title and a function, leadership is more a work style, right? You can have leaders at all different levels in an organization, and you do. So actually, if you go, do a search on Google for leader versus manager, you'll find lots and lots of places where people try to describe those differences. The thing for me, and we had that quote from Admiral Hopper, that leadership is about people, right? And that's the thing that I think very often we miss when we look at the project management body of knowledge, or the supply chain operations reference model, and some of the other tools that are out there. Is at the end of the day, as a leader, what do you need to do to make sure that the people are doing the right things, and are motivated, and are actually following you in the direction that you're trying to take them?
Great. So that is our last question today. Big thanks to Lamar, Gloria, Elina, and David for some great questions. And Daniel, thanks for sticking around and answering those. So we're going to move into the wrap-up mode. So first off, we want to thank Daniel for his time and perspective today. It's been a pleasure as always. So we're going to be concluding our session this afternoon on a few final items. First off, again, the PDF version of the presentation and the recording will go out to each registrant. You can find the recording as a podcast on iTunes or SoundCloud, which will be posted in the next few days. And this will be located on the Supply Chain Now radio channel. Also, we hope you'll tune in for our next Supply Chain Now radio session, where we're going to be featuring Jeff Leroy, who is president of the new APICS Savannah chapter. He's going to be offering a primer on the lean fundamentals. This session will be held December 12th, and more information can be found at apixatlanta.org. When you visit our website, be sure to click on the Supply Chain Now radio tab. Also related to Savannah, for those of you that are part of the APICS community, or interested in becoming part of the APICS community, our next Southeast District meeting is going to take place March 2nd and 3rd in Savannah, home to the new chapter down there. We're going to be touring Gulfstream, one of their million facilities down there in Savannah. We're going to be touring the Georgia Port Authority, and then we're going to have a full day of professional and leadership development and networking. So we'd invite any of you to join us for that. If you're interested, you can shoot me an email at evp@apixatlanta.org, and I'll pass along the details to you. Finally, for those of you in the Atlanta area, we hope that you'd consider joining us tonight at the 6th annual joint industry holiday mixer, which is hosted each year by our good friends over at Twin Engines. A wide variety of industry associations will be in attendance for fellowship and camaraderie. You can find out more information at twinengines.com. As always, feel free to reach out to me if there's anything we can do to serve as a resource for you and your organization. So, Daniel, before we conclude today, any final thoughts on your end?
The one thing, Scott. I was just going to put in a quick plug for the book.
Absolutely.
I get there. For the book and also my lynda.com courses. So as you mentioned, Supply Chain Management for Dummies has been out just about a week now. Really excited about the traction we've gotten with that. So folks can go to my website. There's a link to get it there. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. If you've got other questions, drop me an email. I'd be glad to carry on the conversation that way. Connect with me on LinkedIn. And the other thing that I'd point out, so I'm an author for LinkedIn Learning. So for folks that are subscribers to LinkedIn Learning or lynda.com, I've got a whole course out there on using the direct model called Project Management Foundations Leading Projects, and another course on business acumen for project managers. So those could be resources for folks if they're looking to go a little bit deeper into the subject.
Perfect. And to our audience, Daniel Stanton is a great resource for folks. Check out his book. It's only been out for a few weeks now, and the response, everyone I run into, Daniel, has your book now, so I've got to join the fold. It would make a great stocking stuffer, right? Get my kids.
Buy early and buy off.
That's right. So as we wrap up the day, we'd like to give a big thanks to our guest speaker, Daniel Stanton, for joining us. Make sure to check out his new book, Supply Chain Management for Dummies. Of course, a big thank you to our audience for participating. On behalf of Supply Chain Now Radio, this is Scott Luton concluding today's episode and wishing you and your families a very happy holiday season and Merry Christmas. We hope to reconnect with you again real soon. Thanks, everybody.